This is going to be a sort of fairly whistle-stop tour, and which I hope people will find interesting or amusing or something of the sort. Anyway, it was exactly 100 years ago to the very day. In fact, very probably to the hour and the minute as well, that a group of four men and two women met at this Georgian terraced house just off Baker Street in London, and no doubt they entered it under the watchful gaze of this rather splendid chap, who's the gargoyle over the door. Looks as if he could have been a ski mountaineer, really. And the record of their meeting is the first entry in the club's minute book. And they resolved to form at Maloja the Maloja Ski Club, which changed its name a year later to the Eagle Ski Club. And the names of those present, they included the travel agent Arnold Lunn chairing the meeting, his brother Brian and his wife, his friend Alan Degville, and the formidable Dame Catherine Furze. Now, Dame Catherine Furze is my first subject. She was quite a remarkable woman. She led the first detachment of Red Cross nurses to France soon after the outbreak of the First World War, and became the overall boss of the voluntary aid detachment in 1915. And for that work, she got made a dame and was awarded the Royal Red Cross. And she was also made a Lady of Grace of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Um, but she got frustrated with her lack of authority to make the changes that she wanted to make, and resigned in 1917 and was immediately appointed as founder of the Wrens, the Women's Royal Naval Reserve. After the war, she worked for the Lunn's travel business in Switzerland, and that's how she came to be at the meeting. Um, Lunn, of course, himself was a very significant and eminent member of the club. Um, he built up the travel agency that it later became known as Lunn Poly, which had been founded by his father, Sir Henry. Sir Henry was a Methodist lay preacher before he started. And in fact, the travel business really came as an offshoot of an attempt to organize an ecumenical conference, which was a disaster in reuniting the Christian church, but made him a lot of money. Um, Arnold spent most of his life as an agnostic, but then converted to Catholicism with the full zeal of a convert. He was a prolific author, wrote dozens of books. He more or less invented the slalom race in the early 1920s. He was an accomplished mountaineer and a pioneer ski mountaineer. He made the first ski traverse of the Berner Oberland in 1909. He made the first ski ascent of the Dome in 1917. And that was successfully repeated by an Eagles party in 1968 to mark Sir Arnold's 80th birthday. And the report of that from the 1968 yearbook is in the centenary book Tracks Through Time. Um, he founded lots of ski mountaineering clubs, or mountaineering clubs and skiing clubs, including the Alpine Ski Club in 1908, the Oxford University Mountaineering Club in 1909. Slightly paradoxically, he also founded the Ladies Ski Club, though I think he put his wife in charge of it. And he founded the Kandahar Ski Club in 1924. But he wasn't. He founded all these clubs partly because he had difficulty with one or two other clubs, and he was actually blackballed from membership both of the Ski Club of Great Britain and in 1922 from joining the Alpine Club. And that latter blackballing proved quite scandalous at the time because he'd been proposed by the immediate past president Martin Conway and seconded by the incumbent president Percy Farrar. Um, but the reason that he was blackballed was because some members were a bit concerned that he might use his membership to further his commercial interests. He was let in eventually, and ironically, he eventually became president of both clubs. He had a few controversial political positions too. He supported both Franco and Mussolini, though he did draw the line at Hitler. And he and his son Peter, who was captain of the British ski team and also an Eagle, boycotted the opening ceremony of the 1936 Winter Olympics in Garmisch. And Lunn was very influential in helping get the great ski instructor developer of the Arlberg ski technique, Hannes Schneider, who was very much not a Nazi. Lunn helped get him out of Austria after the Anschluss, and he emigrated to America. Um, the concern about Lund's business interests wasn't entirely unfounded, um, and uh, the Lund's business had bought the enormous Maloja Palace Hotel in early 1925. And it's pretty clear that the Eagle Ski Club was founded as a way of encouraging punters to fill it up during the ensuing winter. Um, so this moves me on to the next of my subjects, because the syndicate of investors who provided the money to to buy the hotel was actually put together by an Irish peer and landowner from County Cavan called Lord Farnham, Arthur Maxwell, to give him his proper name. Um, and Sir Henry Lunn had invited Lord Farnham to stay at the hotel for the season at the Lunn's expense, and he became the club's first elected president. And he served twice more as president in the 1930s. He'd been in the British Army in the Boer War, but he was a staunch Protestant and a Unionist, and he became leader of the Irish Unionists in the House of Lords before World War One. And in 1912, he helped to found the Ulster Volunteer Force to provide militant opposition to Irish Home Rule. And he had them training on his estate, though he did claim that his aim was to use it to keep the hotheads in order and keep a bit of control over them. Um, in the First World War, he rejoined the army, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and was awarded a DSO, though he was taken prisoner during the later stages of the war. And when Irish partition came after it, he effectively had to go into exile in England during the Irish Civil War, because there were a lot of attacks on estates owned by Protestants and Unionists during that period, though the Farnham estate was never actually attacked, and he returned to it after the war and rather accepted what had happened in Ireland, and even stood for election to the Irish Senate, though without success. But whatever his politics, he seems to have become the life and soul of the new ski club, and was soon known as Popper Eagle, with this cartoon appearing in one of the yearbooks. And it was said that the fun only really began when he and his family arrived at Maloja. He was very tall with a booming voice and described as more Irish than Irish. He was exasperatingly vague and not entirely competent on ski, which was a sport that he'd only taken up at the age of 47. And on one occasion, the train at Grindelwald had to be held up while a search party went back to his hotel room to try and find his lost teeth. And on another, he was narrowly saved from falling through a cornice when the guide rugby tackled him. And the photograph here shows the remains of the cornice. But nevertheless, everyone seems to have loved him. And when he stepped down from the committee after nearly 25 years, he was given the honorary title of the Eagle. And so for several years, the yearbook with the list of club officers always began with the Eagle, Lieutenant Colonel the Lord Farnham. Um, but there was another side to the Irish origins of the club, and we've got Brigadier Eric Dorman Smith. He was the heir to another estate in County Cavan, only about 20 miles from Lord Farnham's, and he also had a distinguished service record in World War One. But unlike the Protestant Farnham, he was brought up as a Roman Catholic. And his significance to the club is that he was the first person to propose that it change its main objective from racing to ski touring, having recognised that Maloja was really not a very good place for racing. And he compiled the club's first handbook, which we have a copy of in the archives. And it contains route descriptions of many tours around Maloja, including some quite significant ones. He'd stayed on in the army after the war and was promoted, but he didn't suffer fools gladly, and he had run-ins with other commanders, in particular with Bernard Montgomery, Monty, who he didn't get on with at all. And he commented that Monty's only idea of how to crack a hazelnut was with a sledgehammer. And I think Dorman Smith had rather more subtle ideas of how one could achieve one's objectives. Incidentally, Monty was also a very keen skier, though he was never a member of the Eagles. And when it came to World War II, Dorman Smith had reached the rank of acting Major General, and he was General Auchinleck's number 2 in the North African campaign. And he made the plans to try and stop Rommel's advance on the Suez Canal at the Battle of El Alamein, which was But after that first battle, which merely paused the German advance, he and Auchinleck were summarily sacked by Churchill in the summer of 1942, and Montgomery was brought in to take over. He continued with the plan, which was always a two-stage one, and then took all the credit for the decisive British victory at the second Battle of El Alamein in October of that year. Um, the battle also saw the death of Lord Farnham's only son, Somerset Maxwell, who was an MP and also an Eagles committee member. And after the war, Dorman Smith sued Churchill for libel over what he wrote in his World War II history. But Churchill settled out of court and had to make changes to the text to remove the adverse references to Dorman Smith. And then after the war, after leaving Egypt, Dorman Smith had another controversial posting in Italy, which he was also dismissed from. But he then retired from the army and returned to the Irish estate that he'd now inherited. And there's a picture of it there. Um, and he became increasingly detached after the war from the British establishment and developed very strong Irish nationalist sympathies and changed the second part of his surname to O'Gowan, which is the Irish form of Smith. And he allowed the IRA to train on his estate and advise them on their 1950s border campaign. But needless to say, the IRA didn't meet his ideals of military efficiency, and they rather distanced themselves from him. And the British authorities just seemed to ignore what Dorman Smith was doing and never took any action against him. I think they regarded him as a bit of a harmless crank by then. But it's interesting that when Lord Farnham died in 1957, Dorman O'Gowan, as he then was, wrote a very warm obituary for him in the yearbook, suggesting that in happier times, Farnham would have made an ideal president of Ireland, which is an interesting idea. And but obviously, it would have been completely unacceptable for the new republic to have had a Protestant president. But there's a covering note to that obituary, which was sent to the yearbook editor, and it's the note is still in the club archives, and it comments. Dorman Smith comments that in later years politics had driven us apart, which is probably rather sad. And Dorman Smith was a close friend of the novelist Ernest Hemingway, and was a model for some of the characters in his books. And he was also the model for a character in a short story by Daphne du Maurier, which is set on the Irish border. It's called A Borderline Case, I think. And Daphne du Maurier's husband, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Browning, was another founder member of the Eagles. So the early days of the club were rather full of military officers, so that's mainly what I'm talking about at the moment. And some of them had very distinguished careers. Dorman Smith's own brother, who was also a founder member, was a naval captain, and the club's first vice president was Lieutenant Commander Eric Davis. And I recently spent an afternoon at the National Archives looking up his naval record, and a few details from that are shown on this slide. And although Davis formally retired from the Navy in 1932, he was recalled back to service during World War II, and he seems to have assisted in evacuating the King of Greece via Egypt to England, because he was the assistant commander of the Alexandria dockyard in Egypt, which obviously was a very important naval base for the British during the war. So he received the Medal for Outstanding Acts from King George II of the Hellenes. And the naval record includes quite a lot of comments by captains of the ships on which he served. And they describe him as a reliable and conscientious navigator, that he tackled unaccustomed tasks with great good humour, that he showed excellent leadership and had shown great coolness under fire in action. So in other words, he'd have been just the sort of chap you'd have wanted to have on your touring party when the weather closes in and you've got a tricky glacier to navigate across in a whiteout and someone's just fallen into a crevasse. Probably an excellent member of the club. And in his first season in the club, he presented it with a cup for a slalom race. The club, of course, was still a racing club at that time and was still called the Maloya Ski Club, hence the inscriptions shown on the cup. But even after it had turned its focus to touring, various races continued to be run up until World War II, though generally they weren't revived after it. But in 1960, Davis turned up in Grindelwald and asked why his cup wasn't still being raced for. So the race was revived, and it continued to be run for the next 10 years or so. Its final outing was in 1972, actually as a form of patrol race rather rather than as a slalom. And the winning team consisted of Janie Reid, who I'll say a bit more about in a bit, and Colin Sanderson, who's actually still a member. And the cup was presented to Janie Reid at the 1972 AGM, and it has sat in her chalet near Gstaad ever since. And her son Henry, who's still a member, polishes it regularly and has supplied these photos. And in fact, a proposal's just gone to the committee that club members should compete for it again in its centenary year
Get time
next year.
management sorted out in a minute. Cool.
And we have the Alpenski Skimo race at Les Maricottes, which is on the club program for February. So that could be a an opportunity to re-award it, but that's still under discussion at the moment. Moving up in the naval ranks, we've got Admiral Bromley. He was president at a rather unfortunate time for the club. The Malaya Palace had closed in the Great Depression, and the alternative centre at Sestriere had proved rather unsatisfactory, and the club nearly folded. But Arthur Bromley had a very distinguished service record in World War One. He commanded HMS Courageous and which was present at the surrender of the German fleet in 1918. But after the war, he rather blotted his copybook. He was put in command of a newly commissioned heavy cruiser, HMS Raleigh, but ran it aground in thick fog off the coast of Newfoundland, and it was a total loss, with 10 crew being killed. And in his defence at his court-martial, he said that the charts that he'd been given were inaccurate. But I think I'd still have been a bit less keen to have him navigating across that crevassed glacier. Nevertheless, somehow he got promoted to Rear Admiral after having retired. And this might have been because he was a bit posh, and he held various ceremonial court appointments under no less than 4 different monarchs. And late in life, he inherited a baronetcy after the deaths of his elder brother. And somehow his court-martial doesn't get mentioned in his obituary in the Times, which is very remiss of the Times, I think. So moving on to the RAF, we've probably got the most distinguished of the club's military leaders, Hugh Dowding, Lord Dowding. And as well as his role in fighter command during the Battle of Britain, he was a very accomplished skier, both racing and touring. And the 1923 First National Slalom Championship at Murren, of course, it was only the British who entered for these races. The Swiss didn't deign to do such things in those days. But it was effectively the first modern slalom race, and he was the winner. The course for it was set by Alan Degville, who was at that meeting 100 years ago today that agreed to form the Eagles. And Dowding himself was a bit late joining the Eagles, though he immediately got involved, especially in organising training courses. So he was very involved in skiing, but when not skiing in the RAF, he set up the Dowding system for giving early warning of approaching German planes, which allowed the very small number of available RAF fighter pilots, the few, as Churchill called them, to prevail over the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. And ironically, the German plan to achieve air superiority in the Battle of Britain with a massive attack on the 13th of August. They had called 13th of August Adlertag, Eagle Day. But they finished up suffering huge losses, and the Luftwaffe apparently later referred to it as Black Thursday. Right, while we're still with war heroes, there is Major Pat Reed, who is famous for escaping from the supposedly escape-proof Colditz Castle, though he was actually only rather briefly a member of the club in the mid-1960s. And having got across the border into Switzerland.
Helping organise because he certainly made a difference.
Having got across the border into Switzerland, he stayed there until 1946, nominally as military attaché at the British Embassy, but in fact he was working for the Special Intelligence Services and was interviewing other escapees who managed to get into Switzerland. And he wrote the escape story up in a book, which was made into a film starring John Mills, and he was also technical advisor to BBC's TV series in 1972, which uses fictional characters, but they're ones based on some of the real prisoners. And when he arrived in Switzerland, he met the young Janie Cabot, and they were married the following August. Janie came from one of the very well-to-do first families of Boston, Massachusetts, but she was actually educated in England and effectively became stranded in Switzerland at the outbreak of war. She and Pat both joined the Eagles in 1963, but he disappears from the membership lists after they got divorced in 1966. And at that point, Janie immediately dedicated herself to climbing as many major alpine peaks as she could, both with and without skis. And the 1965 yearbook lists more than 20 peaks that she climbed that year in the Alps, the Dolomites, Greece, and Morocco. Um, in that photograph, which I'm afraid it was the best one I could find. It was actually taken on the summit of Toubkal in Morocco on the club expedition there in 1965. But in 1967, she won the Davis Cup as a slalom race with her daughters Diana and Christina coming third and fifth, and her 8-year-old son Henry coming eighth. And Henry are still club members. And as I mentioned, she was also part of the winning team when the Cup was run as a patrol race in 1972, which is its most recent outing. And she became a major and formidable figure in the club. She continued to live in Switzerland and ran the Swiss end of the touring committee, while Belinda Corriton, now Belinda Byrne, and later Susan Tuke were its UK anchors. Um, Janie became the club's second woman president in 1977, and she also followed her mother as a Jungian psychoanalyst. And shortly before she died, she published her mother's diaries, which recorded her mother's consultations with Carl Jung himself. So she was obviously quite a had quite a lot of things to do. Right, I now come to another major female figure who's held sway over more than 50 years of the club's history, Enid Fernandez, another quite remarkable woman. Enid was told about the club in 1927 by Dame Catherine Furze when they were both skiing at Pontresina. And in December 1929, Enid turned up in Maloya and asked if she could join the Eagles. And she was met by a stony silence. In those days, one did not ask to join the Eagles if one was considered suitable, and that was a social thing as much as a skiing one. One might be invited to apply for election. But anyway, Enid was obviously quite persuasive and was let in. In fact, a week later, she was co-opted onto the committee. And by 1933, she was both treasurer and secretary, and she eventually held more offices than anyone else in club history. And the early 30s was a tricky time for the club following the closure of the Maloya Palace in 1931. There were two fallow years and then a move to Sestriere. And there was a lot of dissent over that, and Enid did a lot to prevent the collapse of the club and re-establish it at Grindelwald in 1936. She came from a Yorkshire brewing family of Portuguese extraction, had skied since she was 13. There was family money, and so Enid was able to remain resident at Grindelwald throughout the season and oversee activities, as well as being the SCGB rep in the resort for the season. She organised the training courses with assistance from Hugh Dowding, and she was a member of the newly formed touring committee. When war broke out, she formally joined the Red Cross, with whom she'd already been a volunteer, and she spent most of the war supervising nurses in Manchester. But in 1945, she was one of the first women to enter the Belsen concentration camp when it was liberated, and she helped run the children's convalescent home there. And she wrote some memoirs of her Red Cross work, which were later edited and published by her niece Anthea Cook-Yarborough, who was another Eagle. Um, and we've got a copy of it in the club archives, and the descriptions of what she saw at Belsen are absolutely harrowing. She took a party of children from there to Sweden and then returned briefly to England before being almost immediately posted to Singapore. Um, and she was staying with Lord Dowding in the couple of days that she was in England, and he had to rush around getting her uniform cleaned and disinfected before she set off for the Far East. And when she got there, she was at the notorious Changi prisoner of war camp, where she encountered two Eagle Ski Club members who'd been incarcerated there. And one of them later had a letter published in the yearbook describing their encounter. And she then spent several years in Malaya, in rural Malaya, as a welfare officer. Um, and there's a lot of description of that in her memoirs. And she got a British MBE, which her sister described as being not nearly enough, and was also awarded the Malaysian honour of the Pingrat Ibrahim Sultan of Johor medal. So that's the PIS that follows her name. Arnold Lunn wrote in in one of his books that the Eagle Ski Club effectively went into hibernation when Enid departed from Malaya, and certainly its revitalisation after a period in the doldrums coincided with her return to Europe. I'll talk in a moment about Neil Hogg's role in that revitalisation, but Enid certainly supported him enthusiastically, and she threw herself back into the club's administration. She served as vice president, she edited the yearbook, and she became the club's first female president in 1965. In 1969, aged 71, she climbed Kilimanjaro and Point Lenana on Mount Kenya. She continued to ski throughout her 60s and 70s and into her 80s in Norway, in Austria, and in her beloved Grindelwald. And those pictures, I think, are from a tour in the Silvretta. Um, and the other photo shows her with Neil Hogg in 1981, celebrating her 70 years of skiing at Grindelwald. And then a year or two after that, after doing a luge run on the Busalp Road above Grindelwald, aged 82, she was heard to comment that it's so nice to find a sport at which I can still overtake most people. And her last visit to Grindelwald was in 1985, just a few months before she died, aged 87. And after she died, various Eagles friends and the proprietors of one of the Grindelwald hotels arranged to have a small hut built on the Foulhorn in her memory. And I'd be interested to know if any club members have visited. I think it's the sort of place where you can just shelter from a storm or sit in it for lunch or something of that sort. But it would be interesting to know a bit more about it. Someone who wrote about skiing with Enid at Malaya was another early member, the politician Leo Amery, and he wrote about her in his climbing memoirs In the Rain and the Sun. He was the club's second elected president, and though he was at Malaya for a few seasons and remained a member for the rest of his life, he doesn't seem to have participated in the club activities at Grindelwald. Um, but he describes one incident on New Year's Eve 1930 when he broke his ankle while skiing with Enid, and Enid just bandaged it up, and he continued skiing as delicately as I could, as he puts it, until she found a hay sledge and a boy with an ox who could take him down to the Palace Hotel. And there a Swiss doctor set the ankle, and he didn't get it x-rayed until the next day. Um, Politically, because he was a fairly significant politician, and he's best remembered for a devastating speech that he made in the House of Commons in May 1940, which directly led to the resignation of Chamberlain and to Churchill's appointment as Prime Minister. But in the 1920s, he'd served as Secretary of State for the Colonies in Stanley Baldwin's government, and which made him effectively the ruler of the British Empire, which then covered nearly a quarter of the globe. But he was also a very accomplished mountaineer, many significant alpine ascents to his credit, and he was president both of the Alpine Club and of the Ski Club of Great Britain. And in 1927, the Geographical Board of Canada was doing a lot of surveying, and it named a peak northwest of Lake Louise after him as colonial secretary. And having had it named after him, he felt obliged to go and make its first ascent, which he duly did after the Conservatives lost the 1929 general election and he was out of office. And the ascent is not trivial, as you can probably tell from that painting. It was in fact made by the west face in poor weather. It's normally now climbed from the east because the access is easier that way, from the Icefields Parkway. And it was done in poor weather with the full force of a blizzard on the summit. There's a full description in his memoirs. And Leo Amery introduced both his sons to the club, and so they were both members in the 1930s. The younger one, shown on the right, Julian, followed his father into Parliament after the war and held various ministerial positions in the 1960s, initially under his father-in-law, Harold Macmillan, and later under Alec Douglas-Hume and Ted Heath. And Julian remained a member of the Eagles until 1962. The elder brother, the elder son, John or Jack, was described by his housemaster at Harrow as the most difficult pupil I have ever had to manage. And he had various failed business ventures as a young man and was bankrupted in 1936, whereupon he became a fanatical anti-communist and went to work for General Franco in the Spanish Civil War, and after that settled in France. And at this point, he disappears from the Eagles membership list, which is probably just as well given his subsequent career, because he was still in France when the Germans occupied it in 1940. He then moved to Germany and was involved in an extremely unsuccessful campaign to recruit British prisoners of war to the Nazi cause. In late 1944, he moved to Italy to support Mussolini and was arrested by the advancing British troops. And the arresting officer was actually the broadcaster Alan Wicker, who did all those travel programs in the 60s and 70s. And Amory was brought back to Britain on the same plane as Lord Haw Haw and was charged with high treason. And there were various attempts by his council and by his father and brother to prove that he was mentally ill or possibly that he had become a Spanish citizen, but they were unsuccessful. And he finished up pleading guilty at a trial that lasted a total of 8 minutes. And he was sentenced to death and was hanged on the 19th of December, 1945. And when the executioner came to fetch him from the condemned cell, Amory held out his hand and said, "Ah, Pierpoint, I've always wanted to meet you, though not under these circumstances, obviously." I think we'd better go back to mountains named after Eagle Ski Club members. We've got Mount Fagan and South Georgia. It was first climbed by a then humble Royal Engineers captain, Pat Fagan, who was the surveyor on a combined services expedition to the island, which also made the first ascent of its highest point, Mount Paget. And by the time the relevant committee got round to officially naming the mountain after him, Pat had joined the Eagles. And by then he'd been promoted to major, and he went on to become a major general and director of the military survey and president of the Eagle Ski Club and a participant in many clubs' tours and expeditions in the 70s, 80s and 90s. Pat celebrates his 90th birthday this month. He sent me a very nice email a couple of weeks ago, and he sends his greetings to all who remember him. He's now living in a care home in Richmond and was very sorry not to be able to get to the centenary dinner last month, though he was very touched to receive the card that was signed by the people who were there. And incidentally, I'm grateful to Stephen Venables, who's provided the photo of the mountain from one of his own recent trips to South Georgia. And Stephen is going there again next September, leading a yacht-based commercial trip for pelagic expeditions. And he's hoping that it may be possible to make the second ascent of Mount Fagan. So any other Eagles who'd like to climb it, see the pelagic website. This next mountain is closer to home, though it's got a rather tenuous connection with the Eagles Ski Club, but it does have a bit of scandal associated with it, so I thought I'd mention it. And it's Lord Berkeley's seat is actually a subsidiary top of Anchelic in the Northwest Highlands. And it's got a rather airy position with a very small bit of rock at the top where you can sit and dangle your legs into the corrie below. It certainly doesn't look like a ski peak. My attention was drawn to it by the club's longest standing member, who was at the London dinner last month, Tony Berkeley. Tony is actually the current and 18th Lord Berkeley, and the story begins with his ancestor, the 5th Earl of Berkeley, who's shown here. He spent most of his life living with a local butcher's daughter, and they had 12 children together. But there was some dispute over when they got married, which wasn't sorted out until about 80 years after he died, during which time his titles was supposed to be dormant, and everybody was arguing about which of his children were legitimate and entitled to inherit any of them. Only half of them were legitimate, as it turned out, and they were all dead too by the time the issue was finally sorted out by by a committee of the House of Lords. But one of the legitimate ones, there he is, Grantley Berkeley, spent most of his life hunting, shooting, and fishing, as aristocrats tended to do. But he also fought a duel with somebody who'd given a bad review to a book he'd written, and he assaulted the review's publisher. But he does seem to have been the chap who actually sat on Lord Berkeley's seat, which he did for a bet. The problem is he wasn't actually Lord Berkeley. That should have been his elder brother Thomas, who was also one of the legitimate ones, the eldest of the legitimate ones, though Thomas never tried to claim the title. Grantley spent most of his life hoping to inherit it, but missed out when he died about 18 months before the unmarried Thomas. And when the inheritance was sorted out 10 years later, the earldom went to a distant cousin and eventually died out. And the more ancient title of Baron Berkeley, which can pass through the female line, went initially to a niece, and from her it's eventually descended to a member of the Eagle Ski Club. So, as far as I can work out, Lord Berkeley's seat still hasn't been sat on by anybody actually entitled to call himself Lord Berkeley, let alone one who's a member of the Eagle Ski Club. But Tony tells me that he was planning to have a go last year, but unfortunately illness got in the way, and he didn't manage to get up to Scotland. The Scottish mountaineer Alan Dawson, who doesn't approve of naming summits after people anyway, has suggested that the top should actually be renamed Stony's Seat, which could perhaps be misheard as Tony's Seat. But anyway, Lord Berkeley's seat it appears on maps as at the moment. So I think we should get back to safer ground. We've now got the Bamber Glacier. The Antarctic Place Names Committee chose to honour a second member of the club, this time naming this glacier on Adelaide Island, which lies off the Antarctic Peninsula, for Professor Jonathan Bamber, who's a club member and has spent many years studying Antarctic and other ice sheets and the ground that lies underneath them. While we're on glaciologists, we've got Gerald Seligman, who he might not actually have founded the science of glaciology, but he certainly did more than anyone to put the process of glacier formation and evolution onto a firm scientific basis. He was basically a gentleman scientist whose family money enabled him to pursue his scientific interests, and he never held any formal academic positions. He was brought into the Eagles at a very early stage as an honorary member, as far back as 1927. But by then he was already president of the Eagle Ski Club, president of the Ski Club of Great Britain. And his magnum opus, Snow Structures and Ski Fields, which was first published in 1936, is an extraordinarily detailed 555-page study of snow structure and the way it changes and the development of avalanches. It's aimed both at skiers and at scientists, and it's copiously illustrated with photographs and diagrams. And I've recently been able to obtain a first edition copy for the club archives. Seligman has another geographical feature in Antarctica named after him, the Seligman Inlet at the north end of the peninsula. So the Antarctic naming committee has really been very good to the Eagle Ski Club. And in addition to that, he gave his name to the Seligman Crystal, which is the principal award of the International Glaciological Society, which he founded, and he was its first recipient. And the photo here shows him receiving it from the Antarctic explorer Sir Vivian Fuchs. Seligman was the club's first touring secretary, and though he served as president in the mid-1950s, he became very concerned of the decline of active touring during that period, and even suggested in 1958 that the club might have outlived its usefulness. Fortunately, it recovered, as we will hear. Finally, on scientists, the club obviously has had many distinguished scientists among its members, and still does have many distinguished scientists among its members. But I should probably just mention this one, Sir John Gurdon, who sadly died just a few weeks ago, though he'd resigned his membership of the Eagles a few years before that, having been a member for more than 50 years. So far as I know, he is the only club member to have been awarded a Nobel Prize. And in his case, this was for work on reprogramming adult cells to become stem cells, which is an essential step in cloning organisms. So switching professions to legal eagles, we've got Nick Phillips, who was the inaugural president of the UK Supreme Court. By the time he achieved that office, he'd already had a very distinguished legal career as Master of the Rolls and Lord Chief Justice. And he presided over the Maxwell Pension Fund trial and chaired the inquiry into the spread of mad cow disease. But he was well known for arriving at court on a bicycle, and I think this photo of him is a bit more appropriate for a member of the Eagle Ski Club. He was a club member for over 50 years, resigning just a few years ago, though I haven't found records of any tours that he might have taken part in. Still on the law, we have Lord Schuster. This is going back before the war again. He served twice as president, though cut short his second term when he was elected president of the Alpine Club. He, like Leo Amery, wrote memoirs of his mountaineering and skiing, which include a chapter on skiing with the club at Maloja. And in that chapter, he summarises the club's philosophy in words which I think remain true nearly a century later, with the emphasis on developing skills for independent touring. Schuster spent nearly 30 years as permanent secretary in the Lord Chancellor's office. And that office, incidentally, became a rather convenient location at the House of Lords for the club's committee meetings in the 1930s. And the minute book records of the minutes of the meetings in the 1930s, the place of the meeting is always given as the House of Lords. And as permanent secretary, he served under no less than 10 different Lord Chancellors. And one of these was the first Viscount Hailsham. And his younger son, Neil, is my next subject. Neil Hogg was a career diplomat, but he retired early and went on to run the Swiss hotel that had been owned by his family for over a century. And he also had a chalet in Grindelwald. And the advert for his hotel appeared for many years on the back cover of the yearbook. Neil was the younger brother of Quentin Hogg, who renounced the peerage in the unsuccessful hope of becoming Conservative Party leader, but he later accepted a life peerage and served, like his father, as Lord Chancellor under both Ted Heath and Margaret Thatcher. And Quentin's son, Douglas Hogg, was an Eagles member for many years and served in John Major's cabinet and is now the third Viscount Hailsham. Neil teamed up with Enid Fernandez after her return from Malaya in 1958, and they restarted the club's training programme. He was soon appointed as honorary local secretary in Grindelwald, thus effectively the club's touring secretary. New young members were recruited. Some of them, like Tony Barclay, are still members. And the training programme was included a week based at the Concordia Hut, where this photograph was taken. And in the photograph, Neil is sitting on a special wooden chair carved with the Eagle Ski Club logo, which was presented to the hut in 1967 by the club. And so far as I know, it's still there, though I think it's no longer very stable and you have to ask the Guardian to get it out for you. And this photo is one that I took when I saw it there in 2008. While we're on the subject of chairs, I'm sure we've all sat on one of these, probably in school assembly. But I don't know whether you knew that they had a very strong link to the Eagles Ski Club, because they were designed by Robin Day. Not that Robin Day. That Robin Day was a sort of 1970s version of Laura Koonsberg, and so far as I know, never went skiing. But the other Robin Day was a furniture designer, a ski mountaineer, and a member of the Eagle Ski Club. They're a bit easy to confuse because they both wore bow ties. And the chair was designed in 1963, and it's still being produced and is the best-selling chair in the world. Robin Day joined the Eagle Ski Club in 1970, and he was a regular participant in club tours. And he joined Alan Blackshaw, another eminent Eagle, on parts of his multi-season end-to-end traverse of Scandinavia during the 1970s. And he served as vice president in the early 1980s. I'm coming to the end. I've talked about some club members who achieved fame in fields other than ski mountaineering, though many have been distinguished ski mountaineers as well. And I mentioned one or two members who've had achieved a certain amount of infamy. Obviously, I've had to miss out many worthy individuals because of time constraints, and some others are covered by the mini biographies in the Tracks Through Time Centenary book, and in the From the Archives pieces that I've written in the last few yearbooks. I will just mention one name that I spotted in the membership lists from the 1960s. A slightly unlikely name. Next to the eminent mountaineer Eric Langmuir, sometime director of Glenmore Lodge, is none other than the future Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson. He was only a member for 2 years, but it seems that he was definitely a skier, and apparently after he retired from active politics, he used to go to the annual Davos Economic Summit and went skiing there. But whenever he fell over, he found he was unable to get up again without the assistance of several strong men who had to follow him down the piste. At this point, he decided he really needed to lose some weight, which, to his credit, he did. And I think there's a photograph just coming up there. And yes, of the new slim Nigel Lawson. That's most of them. And moving on to mountaineers rather than people who have achieved fame in other fields. The club's membership list has included and still includes many eminent and well-known mountaineers. I've mentioned one or two of them already, and I'll finish with a few who are particularly associated with Mount Everest. There's Bentley Beetham, who was a member of the 1924 British Everest expedition when Mallory and Irving disappeared on their summit bid. He's probably best known for his pioneer rock climbing in the Lake District, including classic routes like Little Chamonix and Corvus in Borrowdale. But he also climbed in the Alps, the Atlas, the Tatras, South America, South Africa, Lofoten and Spitsbergen. And he was a talented photographer and ornithologist. He joined the Eagles in 1927, served on the committee, contributed some advice on preparing for touring to the 1931 yearbook. And in his obituary, it was noted that he had walked from the Channel to Maloya in order to get fit for touring. So Mostyn Brown's bike to Mont Blanc idea is nothing very new. As Mike Westmacott was a member of the successful 1953 Everest expedition, and he was responsible for managing the supply line through the Khumbu icefall for the lead climbers on the mountain. He served as president of the Alpine Club and helped establish the Alpine Club's Himalayan Index. And his wife Sally is also a mountaineer, went on several expeditions with her husband, and was one of the first women to be elected to the Alpine Club in her own right, when the Alpine Club finally caught up with the Eagles in allowing women to be members. And both Mike and Sally joined the Eagles in 1988, and Sally later served for a year on the committee. Coming more up to date, we've got David Hamilton, well known to many Eagles, led many tours for the club in diverse parts of the world, and he's continued the club's tradition of long traverses of mountain ranges, including the Alps and the Pyrenees, some of which he's talked about in these webinars. And he's also led 13 trips to Mount Everest, himself summiting 10 times, which I think is second only to Kenton Cool as a record for a British mountaineer. And finally, there's Cathy O'Dowd, who's also led many tours for the club and participated in some of its expeditions. And of course, she's been hosting these webinars since their inception during the COVID pandemic, and has the distinction of having been the first woman to summit Everest from both sides. Having provided myself with yet another rather contrived link, it's time to hand back to Cathy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was absolutely fascinating. I was not expecting to make an appearance, but that was really interesting. We're probably supposed to know this, but why did they switch the name? Where does the Eagles name actually come from?
It seems to be a sort of symbol of the village of Maloya, as we discovered when we were there in March this year. I think they wanted to get rid of the association with a particular resort, and that obviously became essential a few years later when the Maloya Palace closed. But the name change happened within the first year, when it decided to change its focus to touring from racing.
John, just that was fascinating. What a cast of characters. Can you give us a flavour of those early years? Because it sounds like the club would have a resort base, Maloya, Sestriere, Grindelwald. Could you give us a flavour of what the season's activity would be? Was this sort of a base for a month or a week or a season, or?
I think that it is difficult to tell because there's not that much in the way of records from that period. There were pretty regular committee meetings that took place in the resort, mainly just for the purpose of approving new members. I haven't done a sort of full analysis of those, but I think there were probably a few members, and I think a lot of them were the female members. Who were, had the leisure time to spend the entire season in the resort, whereas their husbands and brothers were going off to rule the empire or command their regiments or their ships or whatever, and then other people would come out just for a couple of weeks, and might be invited to join the club and go on a couple of tours. I think probably they were mainly day tours, or perhaps with just one or two nights in huts in the immediate vicinity of the resort. And then it was later on in the 1930s that people started doing more ambitious things, I think, and then it all sort of got a bit more moribund again in the late 40s and 50s. But it was also, I think, a very social thing. There's a lot of talk in the yearbooks about the fancy dress balls and cabarets and things that they had at the hotel. So it was the well-to-do British at play.
So women were part of the club right from the beginning, correct?
Yep.
Because one of the women was a founder. And although clearly they tried for a minute for you to be the right kind of chap before you could join, it sounds like the club has always been much more relaxed than, say, the Alpine Club. Much
Yes, I mean, I don't think you didn't need any particular standard to join the club at the lowest level, but there were various grades of membership, and I need to investigate those a bit more because there was this complicated system of eaglets, which is how you started, and then you became a bronze eagle, a silver eagle, and a golden eagle. And the golden eagles were essentially the people who were considered competent to lead tours and or to lead tours on glaciated terrain. The silver eagles, I think, could lead tours on non-glaciated terrain. And there is a bit about this in some of the early rules that are reproduced in the centenary book. And that bronze, silver, and golden eagle thing carried on right up until the 1970s, I think. And it was John Harding who spoke at the centenary and dinner in London last month. And I think he was one of the people who managed to finally get rid of it. But I think some of the older members, have it indicated whether what their grade of membership was. So it was quite hierarchical, but it was relatively easy to join at the bottom of the hierarchy so long as you were a social fit. I'm just seeing a couple of the comments in the chat that Mike Hendry is suggesting that the eagle name came from the eagle above the bar at the Palace Hotel. Well, a group of us stayed at the Palace Hotel in March this year, and although there are some stuffed eagles around, there doesn't seem to be any sort of outstanding eagle, and there are eagles all over the village, and it does seem to be a bit of a and I think the local town hall has got an eagle logo over it or something, and so I think it does seem to be. We did ask the local Malaya Ski Club, who also use an eagle as their symbol, what the significance of it was, and they thought that it was really just a local village thing.
John, when we were there for the 75th anniversary, so 2000, there was still a very, very prominent eagle, which is the exact image that we had on the front of the yearbook for very many years. So that eagle is the one that I think is represented.
Right, and where was that?
It was above the bar in the foyer of the Palace Hotel,
right, perhaps
in 2000.
It may possibly have been moved since then, and because I certainly don't remember that. I don't know whether I think any of the other people who were at have we got any of the people who were at that on that meet here? I'm not sure that we do. Oh, yes, Richard's here. And
Yes.
John,
Yes,
I might even be able to find a photograph.
Richard.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the large golden eagle at the Palace Hotel is hiding in a cupboard, as I discovered when Brenda and I visited a couple of years previously to start planning the trip there. And I think that's where it still remains today.
This is Tom Stevenson here. I concur with Mike. There was definitely a very large wooden eagle with exactly the same sort of shape as our logo in Malaya in the year 2000 in the main foyer of the hotel.
Right, I think that may have been lost, because I did ask the manager when I was there in March, because some of the old yearbooks from I think the 1970s report somebody who'd been to the Palace Hotel and had seen the original visitors' books with the names of club members in them. and the manager told me that they were not they didn't come with the hotel when it was sold in the early 2000s and bought by its current owner, who's an Italian businessman.
John, could you share with us a little bit the process of doing the research around these characters? I mean, once you've picked up a mention in a membership list or a tour list, how do you go about finding this information?
I've generally just done a bit of Googling because, the ones I've picked are obviously the well-known ones, so they tend to have Wikipedia pages and other such things. I did a little bit more with Eric Davis because I was particularly interested because of his involvement with the Cup, and I'm very into family history research on my own account, and so I'm fairly familiar with the sources available at the National Archives. And when I was down in London for the centenary dinner, I spent the afternoon at the National Archives looking up his naval record, and which proved quite productive. But most of it is really just done by a bit of Googling and sometimes getting hold of things like the books that people like Leo Amery and Lord Chancellor wrote. And so I have acquired one or two of these for the club archives. And another very useful source is the Alpine Club journal obituaries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was just going to ask about the records. You talked about adding to the records and such forth. So I'm just, if you could just basically give a brief detail of the type, because you obviously got yearbooks and there are minutes and things like that. So I'm just wondering about what the archives actually include, and whether you're just adding to them, or
yes,
look after them and all that sort of thing.
The archives are basically, in this room. You can see various plastic boxes with that's where the archives are, and there's the minute books, records of all the early committee meetings, which were are actually sort of leather bound ledger books. Some of the more recent ones are a bit more chaotically organised in folders of typescript and still need quite a bit of sorting out. Then there's the yearbooks, of which we've got some bound sets, and then numerous files of correspondence, a lot of which I've really not investigated. Some of them I think need quite a lot of weeding. I mean, I really don't think we need to keep all the correspondence about options for menus for the buffet at the AGM and in 1983 and things of that sort. But other things are more interesting. I've done a bit of basic cataloguing, and there is a sort of outline catalogue that I've uploaded onto the website. Now the centenary year is over, I may be able to spend a bit more time doing more of that cataloguing, and I've had an offer of assistance from somebody in Sheffield to help do some of that. There's also material that's been donated by club members. Or left to passed to us by their family after they've died. One of the most particularly interesting is some stuff from Terry Hartley, who was club president in the 1980s, I think, and went on several of the club expeditions in the 60s. And there's a whole load of photographs, 35mm transparencies, but also some 8mm film of trips to Morocco in 1965 and Iran in 1969, which may or may not be absolutely fascinating. But it needs quite a lot of work to sort through it all and have a look. And I certainly don't have an 8mm projector, and whether it would be worth getting it, the expense of getting it made into an MP4 file. I'm not quite sure.
Right, there's quite a lot, because I remember when we were at the Maloya Hotel, there was some mention of the fact of, oh, there's lots of records in the attic of the hotel, and you said, oh, we just put them all up there. I was just wondering whether you were thinking
well,
going along and
I don't remember that, because I did specifically ask the manager, and he said no, that they didn't have them, and that they hadn't been there when the hotel was sold in the early 2000s. But perhaps that's wrong. Perhaps there is stuff up in the attic, and I slightly got the impression he might have been, a bit busy and needing to get on with something else, and that's why he just gave me a bit of a brush off answer.
With all those records, it's very interesting, and whether there are bodies in the UK which are there to help.
Well, this is one of the problems that there's is where records, what is in a suitable place for keeping archives of this sort, because my bedroom is probably not my spare bedroom is probably not one of them, and there's things like the Mountain Heritage Trust, but I think they're having some financial difficulties at the moment. There is some there's the Alpine Club Library, but they have limited space. There's a sports library at De Montfort University, where the Ski Club of Great Britain material and the Alpine Ski Club material is. And I think that's probably going to be the most suitable, but I would want to be a bit more sure about it. And I think we probably want to make sure that wherever it is, it remains our property rather than becoming the property of the library that we give it to, because there's a danger then that they may decide that they want to throw it away. And I know that the Felon Rock Climbing Club has had a lot of trouble recently with their material, which has been deposited in various libraries and museums, and they keep saying, we haven't got room for it, can you take it away, please?
Can't we deposit it at the House of Lords? You seem to have enough contact.
Possibly, perhaps we should ask Tony Barclay. Yeah, I see there's a few comments gone up in the chat on this subject. And
by the way, that was really great, really interesting. Thanks, John.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's certainly been quite fun, preparing the talk.